executive session, Chair.
Okay. Obviously, there's no one in the public gallery, but just for the record, I'll read in that anyone in the public gallery can use mobile devices through a Wi-Fi connection, and all devices should be muted. Password details are available on the gallery rules for anyone wanting to connect to the Assembly's Wi-Fi network. 3G and 4G should not be used, and no recording or photographs are to be taken. So if you're content, we'll proceed through the agenda as follows. So item 4 in the agenda is the functions of the Audit Committee. I refer you to the Secretariat briefing note at tab 4.1 of the meeting pack, page 55, and invite the clerk to speak briefly on this item.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I'll just very quickly go through the primary functions of the Audit Committee. The Audit Committee fundamentally scrutinises and agrees the budgets and the estimates for the Northern Ireland Audit Office, the Northern Ireland Public Services Ombudsman, and it also lays the estimates for these bodies before the Assembly at the appropriate time. The committee also undertakes scrutiny of the budget for the Northern Ireland Assembly Commission, and the committee fulfills these roles in place of the Department of Finance in recognition of the independence of the three bodies, namely the Audit Office, the Ombudsman and the Commission. I must point out to members that the role of the Audit Committee is quite specific and relatively narrow. It doesn't have the same scrutiny and policy development role in relation to NIAO, NIPSO or the Assembly Commission as statutory committees do have in relation to their departments. The primary function of the Audit Committee is set out in Standing Order 58 to say that there will be a standing committee of the Assembly to exercise functions in section 66.1 of the Northern Ireland Act and paragraphs 18.2 to 4 of Schedule 1 of the Public Servicemen Ombuds Act. In other words, this says that we are able to scrutinise and then lay the estimates for those two bodies. It should also be noted that only one member of Audit Committee can also be a member of the Public Accounts Committee at any time. We don't have any members of Public Accounts Committee. So the three bodies that we scrutinise and lay the estimates for in the budget are the Northern Ireland Audit Office, and the head of that is the Controller and Auditor General. And as I'm sure members are aware, the Audit Office, the purpose of their work is to ensure that the Assembly is provided with an effective and truly independent audit assurance in relation to the use of public funds. And in the 2011-16 mandate, the Audit Committee agreed a Memorandum of Understanding, or an MOU, with the Audit Office. And essentially, this is our framework which allows us, which outlines the governance and accountability relationship with the committee and is covered in statute. As an aside, the same MOU was adopted by the 2017-22 Audit Committee. However, that MOU will have to be reflected and updated in this new mandate, and that's something we'll come to in coming meetings. So we will get back to that. The next body is the Northern Ireland Public Service Ombudsman. This is a relatively new body that was established in 2016. It replaced and expanded the functions of the former offices of the Assembly Ombudsman and the Commissioner for Complaints, bringing them in again to a statutory single office. The committee's role is very similar to its role with the Audit Office. It has similar arrangements to that of the NIAO. So the NIPSO will prepare and submit an estimate in the use of their resources for consideration and agreement by the committee as part of the budget process. And finally, the Northern Ireland Assembly Commission. The Assembly Commission is set up under Section 44 of the Northern Ireland Act, which provides that a commissioner shall provide the Assembly or ensure that the Assembly is provided with the property, staff, services required for the Assembly's purposes. The Assembly in 2016 agreed with the Department of Finance to look at the constitutional independence of the Assembly from the Executive. This led to a protocol for setting the Commission's budget, which then led to a similar kind of methodology that we have with NIAO and NIPSO, whereby the Audit Committee provides scrutiny and challenges the Commission's expenditure plans and reports accordingly. So in the future, the committee may wish to consider whether it is content to adopt and the same protocols as the previous committees for agreeing the budget and estimates, but that is something that we will come to in further meeting sessions. If that's okay.
Okay, if members any questions to put to the clerk? Okay, thank you. John, you happy enough? Yeah, thank you. Okay. Right, we'll move then to item 5 on our agenda for this morning, and that is a briefing from the Northern Ireland Audit Office. It's an introductory briefing and the 24-25 budget position. And I'd refer members to the briefing paper at 5.1, which is page 69 of the members' pack. And clerk, understand that they may have tabled a...
Yes, thanks, Chair. Members, just to note, there is a further tabled summary paper from the Audit Office, which you in the room should have a hard copy of. And John, can you confirm, did you receive the copy by email? You did. That's great. Okay, thanks, Chair.
Okay, just I wish to welcome the delegation from the Audit Office, Dorina Carville, which is Controller and Auditor General, Rodney Allen, Chief Operating Officer, and Brian O'Neill, the Director. You're very, very welcome this morning, and we look forward to your presentation. So if you wish to proceed and brief the committee, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to begin by saying just how delighted I am to be here and addressing my first meeting and your first meeting of this Assembly Audit Committee as Controller and Auditor General for Northern Ireland, a position that I've occupied now for just 18 months. And I sincerely look forward to working with the committee and in due course getting into more detail about the future direction of the office. But today is an introductory briefing, and in your packs you've been provided with an introductory brief which I don't intend to repeat to you, but rather I would like to just spend a little bit of time highlighting for you our role and remit and how increasingly important our work is in providing assurance to the Northern Ireland Assembly as to how public money is spent. And as CNAG, I am head of the Northern Ireland Audit Office, an office of approximately 120 staff, the vast majority of which are qualified accountants. And the reason for this is that about 65 to 70% of our work is in financial audit. So as Auditor General, I am responsible for the annual statutory audits of over 150 public bodies every year. That's all of the departments, their agencies, and many of their non-departmental public bodies. And this work is of significant importance as it provides an annual assurance over the financial management and the governance of each public body. And that's really important for providing trust in government and trust in public spending. And this work is carried out against a really high standard of recognised financial reporting standards, globally recognised. And this quality standard required of our work is placing increasing demands because it's ever changing. And it has seen our office have to adapt and improve our work to meet these demands, and it's an area that I anticipate we will see further regulatory requirements in the future. A really important element of this work is where I report on whether public bodies have spent the money allocated for the purposes intended by this Assembly. And that's referred to as my regularity audit opinion. It's an additional audit opinion provided. It wouldn't be typically provided by a private sector audit firm, and it requires us to do an additional level of audit work to really look at how public money is spent. And that's really important to you as members. So other things that are mentioned in my brief to you are other important functions of the office include my comptroller function, which is where I play a role in authorising departmental spending as it comes from the block grant, as well as the work of the local government auditor. That work of the local government auditor is also fully staffed from within the Northern Ireland Audit Office, and this is a sector where we have seen increasing concerns raised with us in recent years, in particular increased work required of our office, most notably an extraordinary audit of one particular council that was directed by the then Minister for Communities. But the area of work that you might be most familiar with, and through many of your colleagues on the Public Accounts Committee, is our public reporting work, or our value for money studies. And with this piece of work, the remit of the office is very wide-ranging and cross-cutting. And legislation permits me to report on the economy, efficiency or effectiveness of public spending. So very, very wide-ranging. We formulate a work programme in this area which is strategic, involves looking at significant areas of spend, and it's always designed to try to make positive impact and improvements to public services. We also then produce a number of reports which we call good practice guides, and this through this work stream we aim to enhance and embed good governance and accountability throughout public bodies. And despite a number of challenges faced by the office in the absence of an assembly, I'm really pleased to advise that we have published a huge volume of reports to date in this assembly mandate. These are listed at Appendix 1 of your introductory brief, and at Appendix 2 we also include those that we plan to publish in the year ahead. And these will be for consideration of the Public Accounts Committee and their work. But there have been some challenges since I've taken up post. I joined the office amidst a very difficult recruitment market in the area of qualified accountants and accountants generally. The budget, which had been agreed for this office, for my office, by your predecessor committee for the 22-23 and 23-24 years, was then reduced by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, making recruitment of adequate staffing levels even more difficult. And in the current 23-24 year in particular, I'm on record with the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee in Westminster, highlighting my concerns around the process that was adopted in the absence of an assembly, which saw the Secretary of State receive advices from the Department of Finance but have no engagement with my office or me as the independent office holder around that budget. We've seen significant increases, especially on that financial audit side of our work stream. Changes to auditing standards that we must keep up with, and additional work to consolidate departmental accounts with their arm's length bodies this year. We've also seen a very changing private sector model. Some of our work is carried out by the private sector, and that's had a direct impact on our business model. And we do have yet increased calls for us to do more work in certain sectors, increasingly local government. That said, I must say to the committee, I am very, very proud of the work of the office and of our staff to date and how we've responded to those challenges, how we've managed our workloads with the staffing complement that we have currently. We've continued to invest in training our own staff because of a lot of the market difficulties, and we recruit and train at both graduate and at apprentice level as well. We've delivered our increasing audit responsibilities, albeit with slightly more delay than we would have liked. And we have had to adapt our business model quite recently in response to the private sector, and that will come with increased pressures ahead for the organisation. This year, the 23-24 year that I've touched on, we have managed our resources very prudently, as you would expect from an audit office. But that short-term achievement, if you like, of living within budget is already having longer-term implications for us, and frankly is unsustainable going forward if we are to deliver the high quality, high output that I believe is expected of us. And whilst we have very much missed having an assembly in place and having you all, the absence of an assembly and the absence of a public accounts committee has actually afforded us a cost saving, which we will not have going forward now that the PAC is back up and running and we will be servicing that committee. I am very proud of the work of the office, but I'm also quite ambitious for where we go going forward as an office. The Northern Ireland Audit Office, we are the smallest audit office across the UK and Ireland, but I've had the pleasure of engaging with a lot of my counterparts on numerous occasions now since taking up post, And I'm pleased to say our work and our contribution to public services is every bit as important as each of those other regional audit offices. I've seen those audit offices build on their work, and their respective governments really recognise the increased importance of their work, and their resource allocations increase accordingly. So I suppose to close from me, it is important to say we do recognise that Northern Ireland faces real fiscal difficulties going forward and presently. But now more than ever, I believe that the work of the Northern Ireland Audit Office is critical to provide assurance over good governance, good financial management, and as well to highlight areas where improvements can be made to public services and improvements can be made to how public money is spent. We are very fortunate in the position that we have. We have a real bird's eye view over all of public spending in Northern Ireland. We audit over £26.5 billion of spend annually. And we're a very, very small organisation by comparison to those that we audit. The office is run from within a budget of between 9 and 10 million. So less than 0.004% of what we audit. So very small fry in comparison to the amount of public spend that we're looking at. And I appreciate this is our first meeting today, members, and apologise for being so crude as to come seeking a budget on day one. But I hope you will appreciate that we're being driven by the budgetary processes as we understand them. I'm joined today by colleagues Rodney Allen and Brian O'Neill, and I've asked Rodney just to briefly outline some additional detail for you as to the level of resources required going forward to deliver that high quality public audit service that we believe this Assembly wants going forward. So thank you, members.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dorina. Good morning, Chairman and members. I'll just take a few minutes to add to what Dorina has already said to you. It's good to be back with the committee again. Mr. Chambers, Brian and I are no stranger to you. We were with you quite a number of times on the previous committee. Brian is, of course, one of our directors in the Audit Office, and one of the hats and responsibilities that he wears is corporate services. So he oversees ultimately the financial management and reporting associated with our business. Members, in addition to the introductory brief, the clerk mentioned a one-pager that we sent through to you late last night. So I appreciate you may not have had the opportunity to review that. So following on from Dorina, I will major in that particular one-pager, if I may. Give you a sense of what has been happening to our budget since the previous committee's last approval back in November 2021. The one-pager shows the committee had agreed for 23-24 year a net budget for the Audit Office of £9.2 million. The budget that we were actually allocated by the Secretary of State amounted to £8.7 million, a reduction of 6% against that previously approved by the committee. We have been living within that budget in 23-24, and the paper, the one-pager, sets out a wee bit of detail around how we've been managing that, but that includes the levels of staff recruitment being reduced, and we have a recruitment freeze in place at the moment, and that has been in place since December to help us live within our budget. Statutory deadlines were not met for all audits. We met many, but not all. A reduced number of public reports were published. We had savings that Dorina mentioned in relation to the absence of the Assembly. And we've been absorbing increases in those contracting out costs with our partner firms. So that's some of the things that have been going on in the current year. In relation then to next year from the 1st of April, in December just past, the Department of Finance indicated to us that planning should be on the basis of a flat cash budget, i.e. £8.7 million again, and the department asked us to also model cuts of 2% and 5%. The previous committee had approved for the year ahead for 24-25 a budget of £9.7 million, so therefore flat cash would now be £1 million less, a reduction of 10%. We indicated to the department that this was an unsustainable position, and having reassessed our requirements, we needed a budget of £10 million, and anything less would impinge on and significantly hinder the organisation and the provision of a professional, adequately resourced, independent public audit function. We did, of course, acknowledge that the financial climate and the fiscal situation has changed since the previous committee considered our budget. Despite facing significant pressures, including large increases in those contractual procurement arrangements with our private sector partner firms, cost increases associated with inflation, rising superannuation costs, our forecasted requirements were still only marginally above the amount previously agreed by this committee at a time when the extent of those pressures were not foreseen. So we therefore took the rather unusual step of writing to the chair of the Finance Committee last month when the budget bill was being considered. We were so concerned about our current indicative budget and the constraints that we are presently operating under, the recruitment freeze, associated reduction in full-time staffing numbers, things like that being right at the forefront of our existing problems. So we stated that we would, of course, explain the position to this committee as our overseers at the first opportunity, and we were very grateful then to subsequent comments by Mr. Chambers in the House. Finally, members, in preparing to meet you today, we have assessed our needs again for 24-25 on the most up-to-date position possible. Now, that has been informed by early engagement with political parties and assembly committees, and some of you will have seen us in Medicine, different forum talking about that. The indications at this stage are that most likely members on the Assembly and those committees will be expecting a higher level of service from the Audit Office than what was previously given. We have also revised our needs to further strengthen some of the things that Dorina alluded to, the quality and indeed the investment in our public audits in light of those continuously improving professional standards and the regulatory requirements. Now, that has resulted ultimately in a figure, and it's in your brief, of £10.5 million. And that is the budget that we believe would enable us to strive to provide a public audit office in Northern Ireland to deliver our vision, which is to provide independence and excellence in audit to improve public services. Now, that's a very high bar, but it's hugely important when set in the context of where public audit offices find themselves in the other regions. So in summary, many changes since we were last with the committee in November 21 and you last approved our budget for 24-25. Income, contracting out costs, pay costs, superannuation costs. But today we're asking the committee to give its initial consideration to a budget that would be approximately 8% higher than that was previously approved back in November 21. And that, hopefully, members, gives you a reasonably potted walk through that one pager. I'll stop at that point, and thank you for listening.
That it then?
Yep,
okay,
thank
you
you
very much indeed for that presentation, very informative. I'll maybe put a couple of questions to you and then I'll open it to the members. But what would be your view on whether your independent role in relation to the executive and government is compromised if your budget allocation is not sufficient for your stated needs and duties?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. My role is an independent role. I'm an officer of the Assembly, and I think the strength in the role is that independence. So I suppose the first thing is I really welcome the opportunity. This is my first opportunity to actually come and have a discussion around what I believe to be an adequate budget going forward for the office. I also do have to say, and I touched on it in my opening remarks, we do fully understand the fiscal pressures facing the services, frontline services in particular, going forward. And I guess it's important to acknowledge at the outset, you know, if this committee does reluctantly, you know, wish us to do less work or feel that the finances aren't there to afford to us, we will of course respect that and live within that. But it's, I suppose, having this open and free and frank conversation around it is really important to me in terms of the independence of the role. That said, my dealings with, in the absence of the Assembly, we've had lots of dealings with political parties, with members, and now comments made by our new chair of the Public Accounts Committee, comments made by the chair of the Finance Committee, leads me to believe that this Assembly has very high expectations around the role of our office, what we should be delivering for the Assembly, what we can deliver, and really sees the value and the impact of our work. Over the last 5 years, we have delivered, quantifiable impacts. Brian, confirm for me, over...
Yes, over the past 3 years, in around 70 million. £70
million. So that's the contribution that we make to public services. So the budget that we're here seeking today is what we look at this prudently, we believe is really required to deliver that independent and that objective, high quality public audit service.
In your sort of preliminary discussions that you've had with the Finance Department, are you getting any positive feedback from them as to what the final outcome might be in relation to your budget bid?
Brian's are probably our main conduit.
Other than Rodney's already alluded to in his opening comments, that the engagement with the Department of Finance has been last December in terms of what we were asked to model on a flat cash basis and on a 2% and a 5% cut, to which we responded to. So that's been the length of the engagement with the Department of Finance.
Okay, thank you. So I'll open the floor to members. If any members have any, Nick?
Thank you, Chair. And with your permission, probably just two questions.
Yeah,
if
carry on.
Okay. I mean, I think and thank you for your presentation. Great to have you here. And I think it is important to have on record, just I think across the parties, and I would imagine everyone in this committee would agree how critical it is that we have an effective independent audit service for the work of government here. So I think that's critical to get that noted at the start. Very conscious we're in constrained financial times, so I suppose my first question is, I know that you've mentioned there are savings that you can't replicate now that the Assembly is back and sitting, but could you give us some idea of what sort of efficiencies you have maybe built into this budget bid, of what you can do to effectively live within your means as far as possible? And then really just to build on some of the questions from the Chair, just if you could give us an idea if you don't receive the allocation that you've come to the committee with today, what threats you would anticipate that would represent to delivering your work effectively.
Okay. Maybe ask Rodney to comment on efficiencies, and I'll comment on the threats then. Yeah,
thank you. I suppose maybe just a wee bit of context, a wee bit more detail in terms of what our budget is. So if I quickly scribble in my mind, we've got about 75% of our budget goes on salaries. We've about 13% is going out on those payments to private sector contractors who undertake financial audits on our behalf. So that leaves us with 12%, which is what we spend, and to give reassurance, Brian, what we spend on effectively our overheads and our running costs of the office. So that's things like our payments to IT Assist for running the shared services and providing the IT technology, etc., for the organisation. So that the reason why I say that is just to give a sense of there are restrictions on the amount of efficiencies that we could really deliver for you, but we do give due respect and due regard to them. An area that strikes me, which is very important, and hopefully for members, is we've touched quite a bit on those contracted out, as we call them, those private sector partner firms. I've been around public audit for some time, and this is the first time, members, that I have ever experienced a situation where the market isn't there for our business anymore. Now, what do I mean by that? We would go out on contracts every 3 to 5 years, traditionally with Big Four firms and other firms that would take our work in that space. But in the last 12 months, when we've gone out to procurement, we have had no bids for some of our lots. And then we've actually taken a conscious decision for some of the bids that, frankly, they are too expensive. We believe that we can be more efficient and do those audits in-house at a cheaper rate. So that's been a real change in the market. So that's going to lead to efficiencies internally. They're big decisions for us to take to bring those audits in-house, some of them in the short term, and that's where we find ourselves. And I think we'll see a significant efficiency from that in the period ahead.
Does that generate a increased staff cost though if you're bringing more in-house? So
it does a trade-off. It's the hard cash going out the door relative to the staff available to service those audits, and that comes back. I'll probably talk too much, but that comes back to things like recruitment freeze, where we are in FTEs, and we could talk quite a lot about that. Another area, members, where we are seeing real efficiencies which we factored into our costs going forward. The previous committee generously supported us in a refurbishment of our actual physical building in University Street, and some of you have probably been in that building. It was 30 years old, so we stripped it right back to the bare walls, and we've completed, and we're back in the new building. And actually we're seeing really good energy savings in our usage in that building as a result of moving back in there, more than what we had anticipated. And then we've been doing a lot of work in and around internally on our own contribution to net zero and sustainability, and how we can squeeze efficiencies out of that space too. So all of that's factored into the budget that is in front of you, and I could probably talk, but Teresa covered it, on financial impacts. So we also kind of measure ourselves in terms of what are the savings that we generate for the wider public sector in the work that we do across all of those government departments, and that kind of 70 million over 3 years, and an office that has been costing about 8 to 9 million to run. It's fairly simple then that we get a good payback on that.
Yeah. In terms of picking up your second part of your question, what are the threats? The financial audit work that I mentioned, it's a statutory requirement in the main. So the threat there, and we've already seen some this time, is a delay to us carrying out that work. Now, you might say to yourself, almost sometimes, is that not manageable? Could we not live with a slight delay? Slight delay we have experienced this year, and we're not happy, because when you take that to extremes, if you look across to the situation in England and local government, they're not getting their financial audits, they're way behind. The real impact of that we're now experiencing with delays mounting is, you've councils over there who are bankrupt because they didn't have the early warning signs, I guess, around financial problems. And then we're seeing the impact for the ratepayer. Council taxes are being increased. So that's not somewhere where we want to be. That's where delays to financial audit can get us to. The other thing about our financial audits is the quality. And I believe we cannot, we're in a very heavily regulated environment. We have to continue to keep our quality levels up. That requires recruiting really well qualified staff of really good calibre, which I'm really thankful that we do and we have within the office, but continually investing in training those staff and keeping us all up to date with all of those various changes. The real area then where I guess we could reduce our work and we wouldn't be stepping outside our statutory requirements is our public reporting work. We could do less of that, and that's the area which would typically really be under threat if we didn't have sufficient budget. The outworkings of that is our Public Accounts Committee will not have enough of a role and enough work to be getting on with, and certainly that's somewhere where I don't think, I can't speak on behalf of the committee, but I suspect that that's not somewhere they will want to be. Our early dealings with the committee is they are hungry and they are ambitious, and understandably so. There's other then, I suppose, additional pieces of work which are much smaller work streams for us, but they have huge impact. Our good practice guides, really well received around the system. We've won out this year on innovation and risk management, really important piece of work. We have stuff on the role of school governors, really making sure that governance is known by those taking on those roles, etc. We've one coming up on audit committees. We wouldn't be able to do those. And then any other pieces of, I call them like ad hoc or reactive pieces of work that we are requested to do, usually because of high public interest in an area. So our extraordinary audit of a council, which we were asked to do by the Minister, servicing additional committees outside of the Public Accounts Committee, or looking into big high profile cases such as RHI. We've been asked to do things like that in the past. We simply wouldn't have the budget to do much of that going forward, and that's not somewhere that we want to be.
Enough now. I'm conscious that the clock is running down, so I'll invite Ciara now to ask her questions, and then John will bring you in then. So Ciara, the floor is yours.
Just first of all, thank you for your report. It's very, very detailed. And likewise, just concur, obviously, with the other members. It's a pivotal role that you play. And in particular, as we move forward, we want to see transformation of a lot of our services. and that can only be done with the vital work that yourselves do, particularly with your reports, and as you say, and likewise, I think the good practice reports that you do is critical in moving forward, and they must continue. It's just basically adding to, basically looking for more information on, with regards to your current staffing levels. What's the ideal? What's the percentage that you are basically down? Many additional staff would you need in an ideal world to move forward? And then likewise, in your report regarding your public report work, there's a lot of work that's continuing to be published. Critical work like the anti-poverty strategy, our investment in NI Water, etc. They're absolutely crucial, particularly not only for the departments, but collectively for all of us. Is there any potential delay on those reports? And then just finally, I think you've mentioned it about regarding the contracting out cost. What's the percentage scale that has, over the last, since 2001, what are we seeing? You said it's hard even for them to, but what's the percentage increase that we have seen since 2001 until now? And what's kind of the forecast like? And has that been factored into your overall additional request now in moving forward for the budget year 24-25?
Thank you. Sure, we'll try and pick those up. I'll dive in first.
Yeah,
I'll take the very last question
Yeah.
first, if I may. So the percentage increase is just over 30%.
30.
That's where we are with the private sector firms on average across the audits. And yes, we have factored that into the bid that we've brought to you for 24-25. Can I swing back around on the FTEs?
Yeah.
So you were asking first of all current staffing levels.
Yeah.
So the committee had supported us previously to get to a stage where we effectively have 125 FTEs. Relatively small. We would be the smallest audit office across the regions in comparison with the south. So we were building up to 125. We had a situation some years back where we had a voluntary exit programme in the office, so I can remember us just a few years ago dipping down to 99 FTEs, but the committee was supporting us because we rationalised the organisation, took a lot of the senior management posts out, brought more trainees and auditors in, changed the shape of the organisation. Really important work, but we've then been on a journey to build back the FTEs. We haven't actually got to that 125. But thankfully in 23-24 we were getting nearly there. So our current FTEs had got up to about 119, 120. But the downside of that was to then take that number into 24-25. The flat cash budget provides us, we can afford to pay 112 FTEs in 24-25. So basically we thought, we have to operate on what's been indicated to us by the Department of Finance. So we had to take some very serious decisions in-house, which included the recruitment freeze that I alluded to earlier. So in December, we put a freeze in. So since December, we have 7 members of staff who have left us, and we haven't filled those posts. So it started taking us down towards that 112 that we can live within if we had a flat cash budget. The second part of your question was kind of the staffing the optimum that we really feel we would, well, if you were to give us this budget, that would enable us to have around about 130 FTEs, and that's what we think we need to deliver and meet the expectations of members and the new assembly when it's up and running. We then have a huge piece of work to do on recruitment. If we got some budgetary indications from you, because at the minute we're still in freeze, we can't recruit. There's a time lag in running through those processes and getting the people in the post, so we'll have an awful lot of work to do to then build up our FTEs, which, back to my earlier observation, is 75% of our budget.
And if I could just add to that, one of the reasons that we took the unusual step, I took the unusual step in writing to the Finance Committee and to yourself, Mr. Chambers, was because we are a training organisation and we have been trying to both recruit at graduate and at apprentice level as well. We're somewhat driven by cycles of recruitment that are tied into institute training times, to college times, etc. So that freeze, if we miss those rounds of recruitment, we set ourselves back, like a year almost as well. So it's really important us to get a degree of budget certainty as soon as we can. To pick up on your other point around the delay, any potential delay to the public reporting, Appendix 1 is everything that we are due to have published before the summer recess, and we as an office, we've been pushing really hard to try and get all of this delivered. anticipating a new and hungry Public Accounts Committee coming back, I'd be quite confident that we will have those delivered. The 24-25 year that's included in Appendix 2 in your packs, those are reports which are typically just in the very early stages, scoping, liaising with the departments to gather information. Those would be the reports that would be more under threat if we didn't get a budget agreed. So they take a long time because there's a lot of evidence gathering in these reports. So we're almost looking a year ahead, if not more ahead, to ensure that we have an adequate work stream for our Public Accounts Committee. So as I was explaining to the Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, the problem probably wouldn't manifest with them until maybe a year down the line. But we don't want to be there.
You happy, Kieran?
Yeah,
okay.
thank you.
John, the floor is yours now. Thank you.
Yeah, Chair, thank you, and thanks to all who presented and demonstrated the problems that are arising. I suppose the question is that a lot of it has been covered already, that I was floating around my head, but I'm looking at the fact that you've asked for an increase of 3% over what the Assembly Audit Committee had initially recommended for 24 to 25. But could we be given any indication of whether that 3% would have included the restored assembly, for example, and the additional work there, and also if that includes the staff levels at 125 or thereabouts?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Blair. So we've the 3%, to answer your question, is simply no. There's an 8% then that we've put in, which is the movement from the previous committee. The 8% will address both the points that you raised, though that will enable us to meet what we believe will be the expectations of a fully functioning assembly. And secondly, the 8% would enable us to get up to the 130 FTEs that we believe we need to support you in doing that. The 3% wouldn't get us there. The 3% would leave us somewhere south of that, probably around about 125 FTEs.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
Okay. Happy enough, John, then?
Yep, thank you, Chair.
Okay, that concludes then really the presentation. I want to thank you all for your attendance this morning, and certainly the committee looks forward to working with you, and we wish your office continued success going forward, and we'll certainly give you all the support that is available to us. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, members.
Members, and item 6 on the agenda is a briefing from the Northern Ireland Public Services Ombudsman, NIPSO, and it's an introductory briefing on 24-25 budget positions. So we'll just await the officials getting into the top table. Just page 94. Yeah. Could I just refer members to the briefing paper at 6.1, which is page 94 of your members' pack. Good morning. I'd just like to welcome you to the sitting of the Audit Committee. We look forward to hearing your presentation. So you're represented by Margaret Kelly, the Ombudsman, Sean Martin, the Acting Deputy Ombudsman, and Kirsty McCoo, Head of Governance. So the floor is yours, folks. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to present to you. We really welcome that we have you back as our Scrutiny and Budget Committee, and we really welcome the opportunity to engage with you today and to engage with you further. So you will know we have submitted to you a briefing paper, but I just wanted to do a brief introduction and maybe draw your attention to some of the key issues from the office. So, as you will have seen, the office actually holds 3 core roles. I hold the role of Public Services Ombudsman, and I'm going to talk a bit about that, and that is probably the vast majority of the work of the office. I also hold the role of Commissioner for Local Government Ethical Standards, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And I hold the role of the Judicial Appointments Ombudsman, and that is the role where we would see probably least work of the office. So in terms of the role of the Public Services Ombudsman, there are a number of core areas of our work, and we have a role around independently investigating complaints about public bodies in Northern Ireland. And really that is the vast majority of public bodies. I think the easiest way to explain that is it doesn't include TransLink and it doesn't include Northern Ireland Water, but really it includes everything else from schools, hospitals, GPs, government departments, local councils in terms of their functions. And individual maladministration complaints are the largest area of work of the office. The office was set up under new legislation in 2016. And since then, the number of complaints that have come to the office have doubled. In order to complain of my office, and I'm sure many of you will know, because many of you may have sent constituents through, you need to first complain to the public body, and that's to give the public body an opportunity to resolve those complaints, but also, equally importantly, to learn from those complaints and to bring in any changes that they need to do. But if people remain dissatisfied, they may come to my office, and we have seen the number of those complaints doubled. It's been a consistent upward trajectory, and we estimate that by the end of next year we'll be looking at around 1,300 complaints. We have a total staff of around 60 people to cover all of the functions, so it is very demanding on my staff. We provide redress and access to justice for individuals who are dissatisfied with public bodies, and we're an alternative to legal action, so complainants can decide either to bring forward to my office their complaint and let us investigate and seek to resolve, or they can go to the courts. Part of what I would say to you is that the complaints that we get are complex. Around 40% of them relate to health and social care, but when we take our complaints through our process, around 80% of those that we do further investigation on are health and social care. So they're complex. They often require the use of independent professional advice. And we tend to use professional advisors from England, Scotland and Wales, because we tend to look for people who aren't working in the system in Northern Ireland to give us a broader perspective, and also to ensure that the advice we get is truly independent. And it involves the weighing of often complex issues and advice for us to come to a position in terms of whether or not we feel there has been failings on the public body's behalf. Often the individuals who bring complaints to my office will have suffered trauma from their experience, and I know that as MLAs you also see some of those individuals. They may be in a complaint system where they have been 2 or 3 years pursuing their complaints. It may have been brought about by the death of a loved one or injury, and so that adds a complexity to my office when people bring those complaints to us, and they have already in many respects lost trust in the system. And part of what we have to do as an office is to be clear that we are independent and that we make that independent judgment, but that we rebuild their trust to some extent in that experience and in our office. That is the vast majority of the work that has increased and that we expect to continue to increase. As part of the 2016 legislation, the Assembly gave my office the ability to undertake systemic investigations. So I've been really clear in coming into office and in my role that we are here to investigate those complaints and for individual citizens in Northern Ireland, but we're also here to improve public services. And I think one of the ways that we have really sought to do that over the last number of years is through our systemic investigations. To undertake a systemic investigation, I need to have a suspicion of systemic maladministration, so I don't need a complaint. And we've produced a number of reports since June 21. We produced a very substantial investigation into PIP and the use of further evidence. And we then produced a follow-up report to that in May 23, where we really looked at what progress had the Department of Communities made in terms of changing how they use further evidence and making PIP's assessment. And that report did have quite far-reaching consequences because it's also been brought to the attention of DWP and led to some changes in their processes, and also by the Department Work and Pensions Committee in Westminster. So when we undertake those kind of big systemic investigations in Northern Ireland, their reach can go beyond our administration and my office. In June 23, we published a report called Forgotten, which was to do with the communication to those on waiting lists. And we really undertook that report because I don't need to tell any of you about the length of waiting lists in Northern Ireland. But what we were seeing in our complaints wasn't actually people complaining about the length of their wait. People are surprisingly, I think, patient and understanding about that. But what they were complaining about was the fact that there was no communication. They didn't know how long they were waiting. They didn't know sometimes what waiting list they were on. And they didn't know if something changed, what to do about it. So we did a really substantial systemic investigation in that. And we are currently working with the Department of Health, looking at how the recommendations from that report can be put into effect. And I would expect to produce a follow-up report to that by the end of the year or early next year, giving an assessment of the progress that's been made and what's yet to be done. Sometimes when I undertake, or I propose to undertake a systemic investigation under the legislation, we will look at, is this an issue? And then we look at, so on the waiting lists, actually the confusion that came back to me from all of the trusts in the department meant we were very clear about the need to pursue that investigation. We recently undertook an initial investigation around tree protection and planning. And some of what we seen there made us feel that we didn't need to do an 18-month investigation and put all that resource in. There were some things that were very clear. So we produced an overview report, which meant I didn't make a finding of systemic maladministration or otherwise, because under the legislation I have to complete my investigation to do that. But we did make serious recommendations for change. And again, that's something that we are keeping on the radar. So I think one of the changes in the office over the last number of years has been that perspective, not just on pursuing individual complaints and providing individual redress and access to justice, but also with that focus on how do you improve the system. What are the trends that we're seeing? How do we provide that to committees, and how do they then use that as part of your scrutiny? So we have another of other case studies that we've been doing. We've done one on restraint and seclusion, and we've a couple that we are preparing at the moment, one on the experience in care homes, which is actually quite a regular issue that comes to my office, and another on the identification and treatment of sepsis. And as those reports come out, they're obviously something I will share with the committee. At the last Assembly, I think the Assembly realised that the experience of complaining can be very difficult. And we already know that around 2/3 of people who are dissatisfied with public services don't complain because they don't think anything will change. So the committee commenced my complaint standards function. And at its heart, complaint standard aims to make it simple, straightforward and compassionate for people to complain. And I think the committee or the Assembly recognised that often that is not people's experience of a complaints process. So they commenced my legislation where I am now working with across the public sector to put in place a new complaints approach. So we have started with local government because local government were actually enthusiastic to change their complaints process, and we've done that with local government. We are currently working with health and social care. That is our biggest area of complaint, and it's also our most complex. And really what we're trying to drive in that is a culture change to how health and social care undertake their complaints. And again, I think if you look across the landscape in Northern Ireland, the number of public inquiries that we have had to have in health and social care, not just over the last number of years, but currently, all link to poor complaints processes, all linked to a failure to use complaints to actually red flag critical incidents and notice when there is an underlying issue. So we're currently working on that complaints procedure with health and social care. I mean, I have to say, I think driving that culture change as part of a complaints process, you know, I'll certainly be done my time in office before that's complete, but I think it's really important that we begin that work and that we prioritise that work. And just finally, to draw your attention to, in terms of maladministration, part of when I came into office, I was very aware of was that not everyone knew about the Public Services Ombudsman's office, and in fact many people who had complained and been dissatisfied didn't know to come to the office. And we are an alternative access to justice. We are about redress for individual citizens. We are independent and we are free, and it is particularly important that people understand that and know how to use that. So we have undertaken really a significant amount of engagement and awareness. We did some initial work looking at what was the level of awareness, what was the geographical spread of our complaints, what was our spread in terms of socioeconomic factors, and we've undertaken a really significant piece of work to try to ensure that those who need to use the office can actually access it and use it. And I'm just going to touch briefly on the other roles of the office. So my local government commissioner for standards role is responsible for investigating and, where appropriate, adjudicating where there has been a breach in the code of conduct for local councillors, and that was a role given to the office by the Assembly. Since I came into post, I think we've had a focus on two parts of that office. Obviously, where I get a complaint, we will undertake a proportionate and timely investigation, and where it's appropriate for that to go to adjudication, that will happen, and that is the process as set out in the legislation. But I think it's also particularly important that local councillors are supported to understand the code, that we engage with them in the code, and that we don't have people who are inadvertently breaching the code because they didn't understand it was part of their responsibility, and where we're promoting it. So again, we have gone out in a survey to all councillors last year, and I was really pleased. We had a third of all councillors in Northern Ireland come back to us about the code and about their experience of my office. I recognise that as a councillor, if you have a complaint, that is difficult for the person as well. And we also went out to chief executives and senior staffs in council and to complainants to look at how well that was working. So we are really promoting and engaging on the code. We've done a lot more work on promoting the code, and we're currently looking at providing a number of training resources to councillors to actually online to enable them to really understand what it is they need to do in light of the code. And we've undertaken a significant number of investigations and adjudications. I would say to you that the number of complaints in that function tends to remain pretty steady. It is usually somewhere between 45 to 55 complaints in a year. And the number of adjudications that we do on the back of complaints overall, since the function was set up, is around 7%, so fairly proportionate. And then finally, on my adjudication role in terms of selection for judges, we really have very limited number of complaints in that. I think it's fair to say that I will report this year that we've had one complaint that's gone through the investigation in that. So that's the kind of broad remit of the office. As you will see, we have drawn your attention to some of the key risks that we feel are facing the office, and one of the really key risks is recruitment and retention. It is really important that I have skilled investigators. It is complex work that my staff undertake. And we have worked very hard to have a very positive culture in NIPSO. We have a really excellent staff engagement rate, and we are very clear about the benefits of working for the public sector. And I think the people who work in my office come with a sense of commitment to its purpose. They do the work because it means something for them, but we really have failed to keep pace in terms of our salaries, and it's been in our risk register for the last couple of years, and I think has become significantly more important, and it's maybe something that I'll ask Sean to talk a little bit more about in terms of that and its impact on the budget. We have set out for you a budget, and I'm sure you will have heard from our colleagues in the Audit Office around some of the difficulties that we faced while the Assembly wasn't in place, and some cuts to our budget. And NIPSO also had that experience, and I think we had a real concern. The independence of the Ombudsman Office is key. I do at times criticise our public bodies for their failings in maladministration and draw those to their attention and draw to their attention recommendations for improvement. Being able to do that means that the independence is absolutely critical, and having this committee as the body that considers and sets my budget is actually crucial for that. And going forward, one of the things I'd like to talk to the committee about is how we ensure that that independence is protected going forward. It did mean I suffered a cut to my budget, and you will see, and we'll go into some more budget detail for you, that we have set out that in order to simply keep pace, we do require a significant additional amount of about just over 10% of the budget. And I'm going to ask Sean maybe just to say a little bit of that. And then finally, I would just draw to your attention, a key part of the office is that legal challenge. So both in terms of maladministration and my role as Commissioner, people are entitled at the end of the process to consider legal challenge. We probably get slightly more legal challenge on the Commissioner decisions than we do on our maladministration decisions, but we have had a litigant in person take a number of JRs recently, and I think it is important that people feel that at the very end of that they may have recourse. It does mean that the office then, we do everything we can in terms of mitigating that, but it does mean the office needs to have consideration of that in budgetary terms. I would just say that on my Commissioner side, as yet, all of the challenges that have been taken to the High Court and indeed recently to the Court of Appeal have all upheld the decision of the office, and I think that points to, for me, a fairness in process that is particularly important in all of the roles, and the most recent challenge that we've had in terms of our maladministration with the decision of the office was also upheld, but it is almost an integral part of my landscape that is open to people to take that challenge. So I'm just going to ask Sean to say a little bit on budget, if that's okay.
I think in terms of the paper, I think we've set out what those key pressures in our budget are. They are primarily about a change to pension contribution rates, which we've set out for you, but also when we last worked with the committee, we set out an expected 1% per annum pay rise, and obviously a significant period of inflation happened post the work that we did in the autumn of 21 with the committee. So we had what amounted to about a 1.5% pay rise. The previous year, last year's pay rise going back to August 23 is anticipated to be around 5%, with next year's anticipated to be 3%. So the budget projections that we had previously agreed with the committee fall well short of that. In addition to that, we've had considerably increased costs around our IT costs. So obviously we had the pandemic in between, and since then we've moved to a hybrid working model, and that has moving people to tablets and laptops has considerably increased our costs around that, and also our data security. So those costs have almost doubled in that 4-year period, and they're adding a pressure of around 71,000 to our budget. Increased energy costs are also impacting on our budget. So I think though there's a number of other issues that small one-off costs in year and other things around the review of our governance, so putting in place an independent service standards reviewer, setting up an advisory panel. So those are two of the recommendations that we have progressed with, and the independent service standards reviewer is already in post, and we're bearing that cost. The advisory panel, we have all the work done and are ready to establish, but again there's an additional cost in running that panel in addition to our Audit and Risk Committee. So I think those are probably, without getting into granular detail on our budget, those are the key pressures that we face as an organisation.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Margaret, can I just say welcome the engagement that you talked to her about with local councillors, and obviously helping to increase their awareness of the responsibilities under the legislation, particularly the new councillors that have come in from last May. So that's very positive work. Can I just ask you, what are the real working implications of potentially not receiving the level of budget that you have submitted to the Department of Finance? And if I could maybe ask you to keep your answers succinct, because I'm aware that the clock's running down.
So in effect, we have had to freeze a number of posts in my office because of flatlining our budget and the cut to our budget. So in effect, if we were have to keep to the budget as set, we would have to lose 8 posts in total. It would mean we would probably have to create a queue for people who were bringing a complaint to the office, both at that front point and also then if a complaint moved to further investigation. And it would mean that what I think is a particularly important piece of work, which was on the back of the Dunmurry Manor report, looking at complaints in care homes and leading a transformation piece for care home complaints, couldn't go forward. I don't know if there's anything else, but that in effect we would be losing 8 posts.
So 8 posts amounts to about 13% of our staff. I think, as Margaret has alluded to, we lived within our budget. Now we're very tight this year. We're projecting to be in very close to I think the last budget projection we're predicting a £5,000 underspend, so keeping the right side of that, but that's the kind of pressure that we're under. One of the issues that we've had around recruitment and retention is we've had to increase our use of agency resource to manage to stay within budget. So once we know we've enough resource to see us through to the end of the year, we've had to take on agency resort to help us deal with the increase in the number of complaints. That's not an efficient way to do it, and a longer term sustainable budget really, while addressing the issues of I think salary more widely, which we need to do more work on, is some of the key issues for us. But I mean, I think Margaret's right. We've looked internally at the fairest way of managing our workload if we don't get the resources we've asked for. And I think looking across the UK at how that's been managed, it is by introducing a queue rather than everybody's investigation taking longer while it's happening. Try to keep to our targets, but create a queue to access, really, I think is probably the fairest way.
Just a very brief question in relation to the salary levels that your budget permits you to pay at the moment to your staff. Is that creating any difficulties in terms of retaining staff?
That's been really significant for me. So we probably flagged this about 2 years ago, and that has only got worse. So I have recently lost a number of staff purely on the basis that they could go to a similar role somewhere else for £10,000 to £12,000 more. And that piece of work, benchmarking our salaries, is critical. We have had how many recruitments for investigating officers?
So for investigators and for investigation managers, we've recruited 6 times in the last 3 years, indicating a turn. Those skills that our staff have are in great demand in the economy across a range of organisations. They're not going to ombudsman roles. they're going into other organisations who value those analytical skills and those ability to write clearly and well. So I say it's interesting just where people are going, and those skills are transferable. And I say we are probably well below market rate currently in terms of salaries.
Okay, thank you for that. Ciara, the floor is yours, please.
I suppose just following on from that and the investigative roles and the difficulty in retention, as you mentioned, but likewise potentially, obviously, recruitment, given that you can't compete. Has there been any work done in relation to, I suppose, at the early stage with the likes of Ulster University, Queen's University, with regards to other graduates and how you could maybe promote and encourage going into the investigative role of jobs? That's probably one question regarding, because it's a workforce issue across all sectors. Yeah. But I'm just thinking, is there any work done? We've heard from the previous speakers, it's the same issue. So is there anything done there? And it's about forecasting and planning ahead. I suppose it would be really, really interesting to hear about that. And then, Margaret, you had just mentioned in relation to the awareness of the office and the work. And you had mentioned you'd done some work on about the geographic spread and probably socioeconomic spread as well as who accesses. So I would love to just hear a wee bit of more information on that and what plans you may have to increase awareness of the office, which obviously, consequently, could bring more work your way, which puts added pressures, but I would be really interested in that. Thank you.
Yeah. So in terms of Ciara, the investigators, so we have started an engagement with the universities. I think there's not a particular course that graduates would come from. So I think we had increased awareness. We were at Freshers Week this year to start to engage with students, to tell them about the Public Services Ombudsman. We had really good engagement with lots of students across a range of courses about a career in our type of work. So I think where that led us to, our thinking was some sort of trainee programme. We've never had it. We've always tried to recruit from the market. So we'd done some work a few years ago. We're quite a small office, and we were looking, are there others that we could join up with across the public sector who need similar skills, where we could put together some sort of trainee programme so that we're actually bringing people through for the roles that we then have. And I think one of our colleagues in the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman has created an academy. So we've been watching very closely what they have been doing, how they've developed that syllabus and programme and how that's working. So I think we probably are at the point where that's something that we need to do. We probably, rather than solely recruiting from the market, we need to train some staff ourselves. I think our colleagues in the Audit Office are probably slightly ahead of us in that regard. I remember being at this committee quite a number of years ago and we weren't experiencing what they were experiencing at that time. We've now caught up to that position. So I think working with the universities, encouraging an ombudsman oversight type role or other oversight things, and developing a course either with the universities or standalone with other public bodies is probably what we need to do.
Yeah. I think the academy role you can see even in the private sector, it's just it's excelling, and particularly around the analytical skills, which is a key element. So there is a pull, and it's just basically how to get that young people into that first stage of that work. No, thank you.
So in terms of engagement, so I come from a background where I have always worked in charities, and I think when I took up office, I thought of many occasions when, had I been more aware of the office, I might have, from some of the cases that came through those charities, have actually directed people. So I think I was quite aware that even among charities where there's a very high level of awareness of different routes for access to justice, really the Ombudsman's office didn't always feature highly. So when I took up office, it was really important to me that I started that reach out. And we did a public awareness survey, and we're actually just about to repeat that. And that looks at the awareness of the office, but also whether or not people have ever complained. Then we did some work reaching out, looking at geographically. So geographically, we are more likely to get complaints from east
I assumed.
And less
I
so
assumed that, that's
from
why I
West, hands up. So part of our response to that is we have met with a really wide range of community groups, because we don't need to duplicate, but we need to use what is there. So actually ensuring that range of advice centres, local community groups, who will be hearing from people who have complaints. MLS constituency offices know that the Ombudsman's office is there. So I think we've done 76 different groups over the last while in terms of reaching out, and we had a look at in terms of socioeconomic data. So I think we didn't see the big differences in terms of people bringing forward complaints that we thought, but we did see some difference in terms of people's ability. So that very first stage where we look at, is it in jurisdiction? Is it premature? Is there an early indication of some maladministration? We saw that people who had a higher level of education were more easily able to navigate that stage. So now we actually go out to all our complainants in terms of equality and diversity and ask them, are they willing, when they've brought a complaint, to complete that data? So we've just been doing that for the last year. We get around about 30%, but there's that piece of work around engagement I think is critical. And we're just looking at how we do further outreach. But obviously all of that is impacted by, in the end of the day, when people bring complaints to me, we have KPIs about when we'll deliver those. People do, in the main, expect me to deliver them, and I try to do that. So, that's one of the difficulties, is balancing that work if you're under real pressure.
Happy enough, Kieran?
Yeah, thank you.
Panel, the clock is running down, so before I call Nick in, I've got to ask you maybe just to be succinct with the replies going forward. So, Nick, the floor is yours.
I thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation, and I'll try and be very brief. I'll be doing this myself in another committee in your role before long, and in a couple of hours, so I understand the time pressures. It's just a really, really quick question. I think you've set out very clearly that how significant and important your work is in terms of providing that access to justice. Just for the sort of committee's assurance around where efficiencies could be found within, and it doesn't sound like you have a huge amount of slack in your budget from the potential underspend you're looking at there of very, very small margins, but could you just give us a little insight into what efficiencies that you have worked on to try and live within your means as far as possible?
In terms of shared services, we use shared government services where we can, where they don't impact on our independence. So for payroll and stuff, we use HR Connect. For our IT system, we use IT Assist, which is the government system. So we will use those shared services, and we enter into most of the shared service contracting. So we're asked to participate in contracts for whatever it is that the public sector is procuring. We tend to join them so that we get the efficiency from that. 75% of our budget is salaries. We spend about 2 to 3% of our budget on professional advice in our health and social care cases. We spend about 4 or 5% on IT. So very quickly you begin to see that driving efficiency isn't actually easy in terms of money. Where we've actually delivered efficiency is actually dealing with many more complaints without the subsequent increase in budget. And we did a piece of work probably 4 years ago now with the DOF Business Consultancy Service, looking at our process and looking at process efficiency, and so that we could deal with the maximum number of cases with the staff that we have. I suspect we're going to have to do some more work on that. So I think for us, there's very little room within our budget for savings. Like, we can always save money here and there, and I think with Kirsty and her corporate services team, we have a corporate services team of 5 people. So it's a small team of people who are supporting the rest of the organisation. So it's like, and that's through the fact that we use those shared services. So we're not running a payroll ourselves. Again, we're in a leased building, private sector leased building. We did evaluate that in terms of value for money when we entered into our current lease. So we have some repairing obligations in that building through our lease and stuff. We use the shared service contract through Department of Finance, Construction Procurement Division again. So we will use anywhere we can save money so we can redirect it to dealing with complaints.
But really, you're looking at staff.
Enough, Nick? Okay, listen, thank you very much indeed for your briefing, and thanks for your cooperation and helping us to keep the schedule. We certainly look forward to working with you and supporting you going forward, and we wish your office every success in the work that they do, and we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it.
So John has left us. John has left us, as you can see.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, members, we're moving on to the next item of business, which is item 7, which is the Northern Ireland Assembly Commission introductory briefing and 24-25 budget position. And I'd refer members to the briefing paper at 6.1, which is page 120 of the members' pack. Good morning, and I welcome the following officials. Leslie Hogg, who's the Chief Executive Clerk to the Assembly, and Stephen Baxter, Director of Corporate Services. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And first of all, I would like to thank the committee for undertaking this important scrutiny of the Assembly Commission's updated budget requirements. Now, before I get into the detail of the budget, it might be helpful if I provide a brief overview of the Commission's work and structure. So the Assembly Commission is unlike any other bodies in the Assembly. It is a corporate body and not a committee, and it's responsible for providing the property, staff and services to support the work of the Assembly. Now, the Assembly itself does not have a legal personality, and therefore it is the Assembly Commission that has the legal ability as a corporate body to appoint staff and enter into contracts and provide other services and functions. The Assembly Commission has delegated its functions to me, including responsibility for the management of staff, subject to some exemptions and conditions, such as approval of the annual budget, staff salaries and pensions, and expenditure in excess of certain limits. Now, the organisation itself is structured into 3 directorates. Firstly, we have Corporate Services, which is responsible for leading and managing the Assembly Commission's main corporate functions, such as finance, human resources, building services and usher services. We then have the Legal, Governance and Research Services Directorate, which provides in-house legal advice to the Speaker, the Assembly Commission, committees, as well as having responsibility for the Examiner of Statutory Rules, risk management, support to the Assembly Commission Audit and Risk Committee, information assurance, data protection, freedom of information, the Assembly Research Services and the Procurement Office. The third directorate then is Parliamentary Services, which has responsibility for meetings of the Assembly plenary and its committees, development of private members' bills and scrutiny of legislation, Hansard and the Assembly's IT, communications, education and public engagement services. We also have a small corporate support unit which comprises of the Speaker's Office and the Assembly Commission and Clerk Chief Executive's Office, and it's responsible for providing support to the Speaker, Deputy Speakers, Assembly Commission members, myself and meetings of the senior management team. And now to the numbers. While the Audit Committee did agree a budget for the Assembly Commission on the 30th of November 2021, the budgetary planning context and economic climate have changed significantly in that period, and so it has been necessary to update our budget requirement. I've provided the committee with a detailed paper setting out the various categories of income and expenditure, along with an overview of what is contained in each, and so I'll simply seek to highlight some of the most salient points, along with some of the key changes from the previous budget requirement. It's important to note at the outset that the Assembly Commission will require additional budget provision to support the work of the newly formed Windsor Framework Democratic Scrutiny Committee. However, these costs are not included in the budget, as the Department of Finance have confirmed that separate funding will be provided from Treasury for these costs. The additional costs incurred in supporting the work of the Democratic Scrutiny Committee will mostly be in relation to staff salaries. And it may be helpful, members, if I take you to Table 1 in Annex A of our paper, and it's probably easier if we just work our way through the lines and the numbers in that table. So if I start at the top with income, perhaps the only thing to highlight here is that substantially all of the income that the Assembly Commission will receive will come from executive departments, and that's for the recovery of ministerial salaries. And it's important to note that this is only the additional salary paid to ministers over and above what they receive as a member. The small amount of additional income generated in the updated budget compared to the original budget is mainly due to the recovery of some costs associated with a small number of secondments. If I then move on to the next category of member salaries and expenses. As the committee will be aware, expenditure associated with members is all payable under the provisions of the Assembly Members' Salaries and Expenses Determination 2016 as amended by the determination in 2020 by the Assembly Commission. If we look first at member salaries, there's a very slight decrease in the updated budget requirement from the original requirement, and that is due to a reduction in national insurance rates from the time when the original budget was submitted. Now, it is important to note that while the 2016 determination provides for an extremely modest uplift in member salaries of £500 per annum if the consumer price increase in September of the previous year is 1% or greater. But other than that, member salaries have not been reviewed since 2016. This means that member salaries will be significantly lower than those paid to a member in Wales or Scotland, and the most up-to-date figures are that it's probably £18,000 less than a member in Wales and £16,000 less per annum than a member in Scotland. The figures are slightly different from our paper because there was a new determination issued in Wales effective from December. Now, the Assembly Commission does intend to introduce legislation to establish an independent remuneration board to determine member salaries to replace the former independent financial review panel. And as with the original budget, the updated budget does not seek to estimate the likely impact of a future determination when the remuneration board is established. Any additional budget requirements that arise from that will be notified to the Department of Finance once they are known. If I now looked at members' other costs, so this category of costs includes provisions for items such as disability expenses, winding up expenses, ill health retirement allowance and resettlement allowance, and this remains unchanged. Similarly, members' travel costs provides for the amounts paid to members in respect of their assembly and constituency travel allowances. Now, the original budget did build in the fact that they had intended to issue a new determination, and there were inflationary allowances built into that, and these have been retained in the existing updated budget requirement, and therefore the figures remain unchanged. Moving next to constituency costs. So constituency costs covers all of the running costs associated with members' office, including member support staff salary costs. Now, the majority of the additional budget requirement is entirely due to the cumulative effect of higher than anticipated pay awards for staff in 22-23, 23-24, and what will then be paid in 24-25, and that is due to the rapid high inflation. And it's combined with a slight increase in occupational sick pay and maternity, paternity payments for support staff, offset by a slight saving in constituency office rent. Member support staff costs continue to include provision for additional resources should a member have an extended period of leave to have a baby or adopt a child, although again this will require new determination before that can be effected, but it's provided for in the budget. There has been no change to the budget requirement for constituency office operating costs, And again, the original budget built in inflationary increases that were assumed on the publication of a new determination, and we've retained those. The next line relates to members' security costs. So the Assembly Commission has recently begun to consider security provision for members, recognising that there is only limited provision under the 2016 determination. So while its deliberations are still at an early stage, we have built into the budget an allowance of £4,000 per member for planning purposes, and this is therefore a new requirement. If I now move on to staff salaries, and these are salary costs related to Assembly Commission staff. So a small part of the increase relates to a modest increase in staff numbers from 370 to 375 full-time equivalents of staff. And that relates primarily to an increase in IS students that are engaged through an IS scholarship programme, and also the ongoing need to provide support to a significant corporate systems review project, which is undertaking a project to replace the Assembly's main corporate systems, including finance and HR. It had been envisaged that this project would have been completed by this current budget period, but it has been delayed due to issues with supplier delivery. And Chair, it's probably interesting to note in the paper just the differential in staff numbers between ourselves and the other devolved administrations. The majority of the financial increase in the updated budget requirement, in the same way as the budget for members' support staff salaries, is really due to the impact of higher than anticipated pay awards for 22-23, 23-24, and also that budgeted for 24-25. Along with a small increase in costs following the conclusion of a pay benchmarking exercise, and also a significant increase in pension costs due to a change in employer pension contribution rates. If I then move on to administration costs, and these are the costs that are incurred to deliver the full range of services to the Assembly. The Assembly Commission's administrative costs covers a wide range of expenditure items such as committee travel and expenses, building costs, rates, utilities, third-party costs for supporting business-critical systems such as IT, software support costs, and recurring contractual costs for things like broadcasting, cleaning and catering. The costs associated with utilities and supporting the IT systems have seen a significant increase due to higher than anticipated inflation, along with the identification of new requirements and the ongoing delivery of the Corporate Systems Review project. And as mentioned earlier, it had been anticipated that that project would have been concluded by this period. However, unexpected issues that have arisen during the design stage of the project has meant that there's been a delay in delivering that project, and therefore expenditure will be required in 24-25 to build, test and commence implementation of the new system. Members will also probably be aware that we've had ongoing defects in the roof, and we've had water ingress arising from that. So the original 24-25 budget proposals did not include any costs associated with remedial works required to the roof of Parliament buildings, and that is because the scope, cost and liability for these had not been determined at the time of the previous budget submission. It had been hoped that the issue would be resolved by a mediation process initiated by the Assembly Commission, whereby the architect and or the building contractor would undertake the necessary remedial works at their own cost. However, this has not been possible, and the Assembly Commission has commenced legal proceedings against both those parties. It is increasingly likely, therefore, that the Assembly Commission will have to proceed to undertake the works required to repair the defects in the roof ourselves, in order to prevent further deterioration in the fabric of the building and to mitigate against any health and safety risks while progressing the litigation claim in parallel. In the interests of prudence, while the timing of the necessary work to undertake the remedial works is uncertain, some or all of it could be incurred, in fact, in 25-26. But for prudence, we have included the full amount of the statement of claim in this budget period. The full cost and schedule of works is currently in development, and therefore this cost estimate and timing could change. It is also hoped that the full costs of recovery will be met through the litigation process. However, again, in the interest of prudence, we haven't recognised any potential income in the budget. If I then move on to payments for political parties under the Financial Assistance for Political Parties Scheme 2016, or the FAP scheme as we may know it. So the original budget for FAP assumed that a new scheme would be published. However, as any new scheme must be considered by the Assembly, it could not be progressed while the Assembly was not conducting normal business. So the updated budget requirement for FAP therefore remains unchanged, and it does include provision for an opposition party and the cumulative impact of inflationary increases that we had envisaged had an earlier FAP scheme been adopted. Finally, moving on to depreciation and impairment. While the updated capital budget for 24-25 is higher than originally anticipated, depreciation and impairment expenditure is based on expenditure in preceding periods, and therefore it remains unchanged. And finally then, if I can move on to capital investment. So the Assembly Commission has identified the need to undertake a number of capital projects during 24-25. Now, a number of these are carried forward from earlier years due to the timing and change of capital projects from one year to the next. But some other new projects have also been identified, and these are all set out in Table 2 and Annex B of the paper. The most significant additional cost is to replace our specialised legislative drafting software, which is coming to the end of its useful life. And this software is used to produce all of the legislative documents and plenary documents to the required format and standard. This software is business critical and pivotal in providing an efficient, high quality service to the Speaker, members and other key stakeholders. It's a very niche market and the costs are considerable. A number of other IT related costs have been identified, primarily to replace or upgrade the IT support network. The Assembly Commission has been relying on ageing and in some cases legacy technology, which is well past its useful life, and significant investment is now required to ensure that the Assembly is provided with and supported by robust, modern and secure IT systems. It's also planned that the ongoing programme of upgrading and improving accommodation here in Parliament buildings will continue during 24-25. So the costs of proposed enhancements to the Senate Chamber for Broadcasting, the Long Gallery, the Blue Flax and the Visitors Restaurant are included in the updated budget requirements. The programme for capital projects is ambitious, but we do believe it is deliverable and achievable. And just before I finish, Chair, I would like to record my thanks to Assembly Commission staff. Since May 2020, we've faced many challenges pending the return of full Assembly business. However, staff have remained flexible and have worked hard to ensure that when business returned at extremely short notice, they were able to deliver the full range of services to the usual high standard, supporting the Assembly with its busy parliamentary programme. I cannot say enough about the professionalism, dedication and expertise that our staff have shown. I therefore want to take this opportunity to put on record my thanks to the Assembly Commission staff for all their efforts in supporting the Assembly and all of the members, particularly through the first month since normal Assembly business has resumed. This has been an extremely challenging period for staff, and staff are stretched, but they have ensured that all Assembly and committee business has been delivered, and that this has required a significant team effort to ensure that this was achieved, and that has been delivered by support from all business areas. So, Chair, that's all I was proposing to say at this point, and Stephen and I are very happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for that. And can I just add my appreciation to the Commission staff, because they really have hit the ground running, and it's been I think it's been a fairly seamless operation from my position in sitting in the Assembly. But just to not want to labour the the point about the water ingress into the building, because it's been an ongoing issue over the last sort of number of years. But we've seen one of the consequences of it in the collapse of the roof in the canteen, which I assume was linked to that. Would that be correct? It was assumed to be linked to the...
It's not a collapse of the roof, that's really been cordoned off just because there's a light well there, and it's just from a health and safety perspective.
Right. Is there any possibility that there are other unseen consequences of this, the water ingress into the building? I mean, it's very unsightly to be walking in the corridors and see various buckets of, sitting, catching the leaks and so forth, but it has the potential been explored that other parts of the building could be under threat, unseen maybe at the moment, but has that been sort of looked at and explored, that potential?
We don't believe so, Chair. I mean, we have everything that we've been doing in connection with the roof. We have been taking advice from expert architects and expert building surveyors, and all the work that we've done in terms of the litigation and trying to progress resolution has been done with advice from senior and junior counsel, external legal advisors, our own in-house legal advisors, and also a roof project manager. So we also undertake regular inspections of the roof. So we've had those experts have produced reports. We have put in place a number of mitigations, such as cordoning off the back parapet of the building, cordoning off access to the inner light wells, etc. And that's from a health and safety perspective. So following all of those inspection reports, we don't believe that there are any further unseen defects that we are not currently aware of. I mean, I can obviously not give you any guarantee, but certainly all of the defects have been identified by our experts, and those are recorded and documented. And equally, if there were any other defects that were to arise that related back to the defects in the roof, we would seek to add those to our statement of claim and the litigation process.
I appreciate it's a very difficult situation for you, and I wish you well as you go forward and try to solve. I'm sure we'll all be pleased to see the end of the issue and not be talking about it any further. Nick, I'll bring you in then.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm conscious of time here, so I'll keep this very quick. Add my thanks to the Commission staff. As a new member, I've probably been one of the ones torturing everybody since the Assembly came back, trying to figure out what's going on. So really the professionalism and the accessibility of the staff has really been very much appreciated from my perspective. I just wanted to pick up particularly on utility costs. I know some of those are entirely outside of your control, and we're all subject to those inflationary pressures, constituency offices not least. Experience in that, but can you give us some assurances around what work is done in the sort of energy efficiency space to make sure this is obviously an old building? I appreciate difficult to heat and there are challenges there, but is everything that could possibly be being done to ensure that the energy efficiency is prioritised in this building? Can you give us some detail on that? Because I think that is it's essential that we get that confidence that there is no stone unturned in that space.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we do have a sustainable environmental services unit here in the Assembly, and actually whenever the roof works were undertaken, a number of sustainable measures were put in, such as rainwater harvesting, solar panels on the roof. And we've also installed monitoring equipment so that we can track our water usage, electricity, gas usage, even in terms of our waste and so on. So we do take this very seriously. And over the years, we've installed a number of measures to try and reduce our energy consumption, such as automated lighting. We have moved away from heavy use television screens. We are very focused, as I say, on monitoring the usage of all of those utility costs and looking for opportunities to reduce those where we can, albeit it does have to be recognised that we are an old building, and even just the structure of the building in terms of the number of floors, the number of offices, etc. within that is very difficult. So we do produce an annual plan every year by which we set ourselves targets, and we do report on the outcome against those targets. So every year we set new and additional targets to try and make sure that we are being as efficient as we possibly can. Don't know if there's something you want to add, Steve?
No, pretty much Leslie's covered everything there. As Leslie has said, we are looking to even enhance our monitoring of all our utility bills with real-time monitoring of each of the utilities that we have into the building. So we're always looking to enhance that offering to ensure that we maintain that tight control as far as possible.
Okay.
Yeah, and thank you, Leslie and Stephen, for not only the detailed written report, but also Leslie taking us through the detail of it and the understanding of it. What discussion has been had with the Department of Finance to date on the budget going forward, and what would be the key high risks for yourselves in not securing that budget?
Well, we had provided some updated budget figures to the Department of Finance, I think towards the end of January at that period, and they'd asked us to budget under a couple of different scenarios with flat cash budget and also with reductions in that budget. However, there's very little discretionary expenditure in our budget, and therein lies the difficulty. We obviously have a statutory obligation to provide services to the Assembly, and therefore those services do need to be provided. Now, we are very conscious, and we do try and provide those in the most efficient and effective way. And obviously, if you look at the numbers of staff that we have compared to, for example, Scotland and Wales, I think the gap actually has widened significantly, I think, over the last couple of years. So you can see that we are trying to provide most of the services to the Assembly with significantly lower staff numbers than in other parliaments. So therefore it is extremely difficult. Again, as we've talked, if you look at our budget requirement, you know, there's some money in there we've put for the roof. Now, whether that is all or any incurred in 24-25, or whether that might move out to 25-26, there's a potential there. But obviously, if we weren't to undertake those remedial works, the state of the roof would continue to deteriorate. Now, as I said, we do hope to recover that money through legal proceedings, so hopefully that's simply a timing difference between when the money is paid out and when we may get recovery of that. But again, I mentioned one of the new additions was in relation to our bill drafting software, for example. Now, that is a key piece of software for the Assembly, and it's also used by the Office of Legislative Counsel. So that really is at the end of its useful life, and the existing system is no longer supported, and we've had to try and extend the software support on a very temporary basis. So it's very difficult to see how we can make any savings. If you turn to things like training and development, those costs are very low. We do have a youth assembly here, which members have been extremely keen to see that up and running. You know, it is discretionary, but again, we feel that is absolutely core to the engagement of young people in democracy in Northern Ireland going forward. So it's very, very difficult. I mean, we can look at the figures up and down, but there's very little discretionary expenditure in them. You know, this is a public building. We are required to provide statutory services, and therefore there's very little. We actually could probably do with significantly greater amounts of money if we were honest.
Thank you.
Okay, listen, thank you very much indeed for your presentation, and can I just ask you maybe to convey our appreciation to, you know, the security staff, canteen staff, the cleaners, the maintenance, the admin, all the people who make such contribution to this democratic process. So thank you very much for all that you do. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair, and the staff will very much appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, members, swiftly moving along. Item 8 on the agenda, next steps for current budget process, and I refer you to 8.1 page 138 of the members' packs. I'm going to invite Nick to speak briefly on this item.
Thank you, Chair. Under normal circumstances, in a normal budgetary cycle and year, what we have seen today would be happening over a 2 or 3 month period. So we would be starting with looking at corporate plans of the 3 bodies that we have responsibility for. We would then be speaking to officials from the Department of Finance to understand their thinking over that process. We would then go back to the public bodies and come to a conclusion as to where their budgetary needs lie and how that compares to where the Department of Finance feels it can provide budget. The committee would then deliberate and actually come up with a full report on those conversations and all of the evidence that we had provided, and we would then provide that report to the Assembly, and there could potentially be a debate over that. So the normal process isn't happening this year at all, and I think it's worth talking about just briefly, Chair, that's where we would normally be. This would have happened, we would have taken much more evidence, and we would really get down to the nitty-gritty that I think, as you mentioned earlier on, in terms of the budget. This year, things have happened really the other way round. So just the timing of the Assembly coming back, with the Speaker and the Executive being installed the first week of February, it was then really the Department of Finance that have driven the process in asking all public bodies, including the 3 public bodies that we have responsibility for, to actually provide a budget submission, which they had to do by the end of last month. And they have reflected today on the submissions that they've provided. What would have normally happened is that we would have already spoken to the Department of Finance, and we would have had quite detailed discussions with them. Obviously that hasn't happened, and as of today, the committee has had no communication from the department at all. So if I may, Chair, through yourself, I would suggest that the committee urgently needs to get the Department of Finance's opinion. Again, as you've heard today, it's clear that where they appear to be suggesting the budgets may lie for these 3 bodies is not quite what the bodies have asked for in terms of their submissions. So we can't really move any further forward until we have heard from the Department of Finance, and that's something that I would suggest again through the Chair that we do very quickly, if we can. There is a slight, in terms of the timescales moving forward, it's my understanding that the Department of Finance, the Minister, will bring a draft budget to the Executive. In terms of budget planning, what the budget would actually be, I think the first week after Easter recess. That's certainly what the Minister has indicated in public, and so therefore you would expect that the Executive would have agreed the figures probably by the 10th or 11th of April. Over the course of the next couple of weeks, we would see that process happening through the Chamber via the budget bill. It would be very difficult for this committee to stand up and talk in that process, and yourself, Chair, and the other members, saying what we feel and have agreed that the budget should be through those 3 bodies without understanding and getting beforehand what it is actually going to be. And so the process is quite different this year, and unfortunately it's just the way that it is, and we have to deal with it. So may I suggest that we write to the Department of Finance and give them a fairly tight time scale, perhaps a week, to be able to actually come back to us with their thoughts on the budget submissions that, remember, they have had for a couple of weeks from the 3 bodies that we've heard from today. We also need to, we would normally ask for the views of the Public Accounts Committee, again, on the 3 budgets, especially with the Audit Office inextricably linked. We can write to the Public Accounts Committee. Realistically, it might take them a little bit longer to actually come back to us, but we will do that as well. I would then suggest again through the Chair that if we hear back from Finance within the next week, that we then actually meet again, if we can, before Easter recess, to then come to an agreed position. Instead of then providing a report, because we just haven't got time to do that, we can then provide our agreed position via a letter to the Minister and to the bodies and to the Assembly. So we're not doing this process as we normally would, and we will hopefully see later this year the way that things should happen if the normal timescales are there. So that would really be where I think we are, Chair, in terms of what we need to do from now. Obviously, if any members have any.
Okay, well, listen, before I move to seeking your agreement, members, on the actions suggested and recommended by the clerk, and I just ask anybody any questions for the clerk? No? Okay, then, so I'm seeking agreement for the committee to write urgently to the Minister of Finance to seek her views on the budget submissions of the three bodies the committee have met today. Are we agreed?
Agreed, yeah.
And seek agreement for the committee to write urgently to the Public Accounts Committee to seek its views on the budget submissions of the three bodies the committee have met today. Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Moving to the next item of business then, number 9, correspondence, and refer members to the correspondence received on page 144 of the pack. And I'm seeking agreement to action correspondence as suggested in the table at page 144 to send a copy of signed minutes from the first meeting to Mr. McCourt Kelly. Are we agreed?
Agreed, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So moving to the next item of business, which is any other business. So you have any other items you wish to raise? Great to see nodding heads. No, thank you. Okay, so moving on to the next item of business is, like I alluded to, it's the date, time, place of the next meeting. Just inform members that dependent on the timescales of interaction with the Department of Finance, the next meeting of the committee may be held on Wednesday the 20th of March in room 21 at 10 a.m. or Tuesday the 9th of April in room 21 at 1:05. The clerk will inform members once the next meeting is scheduled. So it just falls me to now to adjourn the meeting and thank you for your cooperation. Thank you.
Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
And also place and record my
Committee Room 21. Sound. Committee Room 21. Sound.